Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
Good morning. This is the second family service in a row that I've spoken at, and I'm never quite sure how to follow the kids. It's always a bit of an anticlimax when I get up here, I think, but I'll do my best. It's really good to see you all, especially if you're with us for the first time this morning. You're especially welcome, and over this period of Easter, we as a church are doing a three-part series entitled This is Love. And my focus this morning, just for 10 minutes or so, is on God's love for us. And at this time of year, we remember in the church the 3-day period from which Jesus died on the cross and then rose again back to life. And in truth, it's the most important event in the whole Christian calendar. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But actually, in modern society, it doesn't necessarily get the same level of attention or hysteria or hype than maybe certain other celebrations do, like Christmas, for example. Now, if we're not careful, we can actually let Easter sort of pass us by a little bit. Especially if we don't attend church regularly, then it can just become, that time of year where we eat a lot of chocolate and we have a slightly extended weekend. But actually what we're remembering at this time of year is the most fundamental, pivotal, game-changing event that we read about in the whole Bible. And the reason for that is that what happened at Easter time, what happened on the cross with Jesus dying, was all about God's love for his people. But more than that, it's actually the most outrageous, most intense display of love that the world has ever seen, in fact. And this whole event, the crucifixion, is essentially a sacrifice. That's what was taking place here. And actually, in the Bible, you can read quite a lot about sacrifices, particularly in the Old Testament. And generally, we're talking about sacrifices in the form of animals in the Old Testament being sacrificed to God to make up for the sins of man, essentially. So in other words, the sacrifice of an animal to God was to make up for something wrong that had been done by mankind. And in the Old Testament book of Leviticus and chapter 4, we read about something called sin offerings. And it says this: if any member of the community sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, when they realize their guilt and the sin they have committed becomes known, they must bring as their offering for the sin they committed a female goat without defect. So essentially here, what's happening is to make up for something wrong that's been done, something perfect has to be given up in its place. And it had to be something perfect. It had to be something without defect. Because essentially, this payment had to cost you something. There had to be a cost for what had gone wrong. And actually, that's really important because the not having a defect was what gave that thing value. And there had to be a cost associated with the sacrifice. So wealthier people were actually required to give more significant sacrifices than poorer people, because it really had to cost you something. And I think the world still works like that today. For every action, there is a consequence, whether good or bad. For every action, there is a reaction of some description. And generally, when we get things wrong, the consequence of that involves a sacrifice of some description. If I were to upset one of you through doing something wrong, which I would never do, of course, but if I did, then actually there would be a sacrifice involved in me making that situation right. And that sacrifice could take a few forms. It might be a sacrifice of my pride. I might have to humble myself in order to admit that I'd made a mistake in that situation. It might be a sacrifice of my happiness for a period of time where I had to live with what I'd done, with the fact that I'd upset you. It might be simply a sacrifice of my time to actually take that time to make that situation right. But there is always a cost. There is always a consequence to that action. And essentially, this is what Jesus was doing on the cross. He was the sacrifice for the wrongdoing of man. And more than that, he was the perfect sacrifice. We read in the New Testament book of Corinthians, in chapter 5, verse 21, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. And Jesus was both man and God. And this is a slightly complicated concept, I suppose. He was God's son. He was very much a part of who God was. But also the Bible tells us that he was fully man. So despite being God, he still experienced the same feelings, the same emotions, the same temptations that we all experience daily. But yet we're told in the Bible that he never sinned. And that's a very churchy word for doing wrong. He never did anything wrong against God or against God's commandments while he was on the earth. So he was this perfect, unblemished sin offering that we read about in Leviticus, but on steroids. Because actually, for one little mistake, it might be enough to sacrifice a lamb or a bull or a bird. But actually, what Jesus was sent to be the sacrifice for was so much bigger than that. He was sent to be the sacrifice for all of the wrongdoing in mankind, and not actually just for the time in which he lived, but for all of earthly eternity as well. And that's a pretty big mess to sort out. I'm reminded more now than ever of just how broken our world is. You don't have to look very far nowadays, do you? Every day it's all around us. You only have to switch on your TV or open your newspaper and it's there in front of you. The latest tragedy, the latest injustice going on around the world. But even much more locally in our lives, in our friendship groups, in our family situations. The world can seem a complete and utter mess sometimes, can't it? There's so much going on around us: abuse, disease, divorce, bankruptcy, poverty, betrayal. This kind of stuff is around us all the time. And actually it can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes, just how broken this world can appear. And this is why Jesus had to go to the cross. The mess was so huge that something had to pay that cost. Because before Jesus came on the scene, we had a situation where we had a perfect God and we have a fundamentally broken world and an absolute chasm in between those two things. So actually, it needed to be the most perfect sacrifice that could possibly be given to make up that ground, to pay the true cost for the broken nature of mankind. So what does all of this have to do with love? You might think that's all well and good, but without sounding too much like Tina Turner, what's love actually got to do with all of that? Well, there's actually a much deeper tragedy to what happened on the cross than we get at face value. At face value, it's a tragedy anyway. There's a guy who's been crucified, a guy who's been killed at, in possibly the most incredibly cruel way we could imagine. But actually, the deeper tragedy is that there's a situation here where a father loses his son. And not only a father loses his son, but a father chooses to give up his son to death for the sake of somebody else. Because Jesus was God's son, he was a very part of him. And I know that lots of you here today will be parents. Some of you might be here purely because of the fact you're a parent and your child was involved this morning. And you will probably understand this more than I can, because I'm actually not a parent. I've got 3 younger brothers, I've got a baby nephew, and the thought of giving up one of those to death for the sake of somebody else is unthinkable to me. So I can only imagine how much more painful the thought must be to give up your child for the sake of somebody else. But that's ultimately what we're remembering at this Easter time. In the book of Romans, again in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul writes, "Very rarely will anybody die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." You see, giving up your child for even the nicest person, even the most seemingly innocent person, is still unthinkable, isn't it? Because regardless of how good that person might be, it just doesn't compare in our minds to the relationship between a parent and a child. In our human comprehension, we can't actually envisage a love that goes further than that of a parent and their child. But maybe if you are a particularly special human being, if you are some form of superhuman being, you might possibly be able to imagine a situation where you might consider doing that for somebody that you thought really, really deserved it. For probably the most perfect innocent person in this world, you might possibly be able to envisage that. But how much harder is it to try and envisage giving up your child for somebody who doesn't deserve it? Giving up your child to death for somebody who's guilty? How unthinkable is that? Well, that's what God did for you, and that's what God did for me. While we were still sinners, while we were broken, imperfect human beings, he thought us worth that cost. He thought us worthy of that sacrifice. And whether we like it or not, none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. I make more than most. But even in my broken state, God thought me worthy of that sacrifice. And that's a pretty incredible thought, that he would give up a very part of him for me. Church, this is love. And it's a love that far outweighs anything that my human mind can comprehend. It's a love that goes far further than anything I could possibly imagine. It's the most pure, perfect example of love that the history of this world has ever seen. You could look at this world and get a bit depressed. I listed a bunch of reasons earlier on why you might do. But actually there is a strange comfort in just how broken this world is. That there's almost a strange glory in it, actually. Because no matter how bad things get on this earth, no matter how desperate it seems at times, God still thought it worth the cost. In spite of all of that, he thought me and he thought you worthy of that cost. While we were sinners, while we are still sinners, Christ died for us. And you might be sat here this morning thinking, well, that's great, but he can't have died for me. You might be thinking, I've never given God the time of day in my whole life. I've never prayed, I've never picked up a Bible. This might be your first time in church this morning. And you might be thinking, why on earth would this guy who I've never given the time of day to have given up his life for me? But if you remember one thing from this morning, I want you to remember that he did die for you. He died for you personally. He died for me personally. In 1 John 4 verse 19, it says, we love because he first loved us. And you see, Jesus died for you even if his love for you isn't reciprocated. He died for you even if you've never taken the time to even say hello to him. But at this Easter time, I'd be bold enough to say, if there is a chance that there is a love available to you that would go that far for you, if there is somebody out there that could love you in a way that far exceeds anything that in our human comprehension we could possibly understand, might it not be worth just taking the time to get to know that person? Might it not be worth just exploring a little bit maybe? My time has gone, but if you'd like to talk to me afterwards about anything I've said, then come and grab me or grab somebody that you came with or someone that you trust and talk to them. But if you've got any questions, please don't leave without speaking to somebody this morning. Have a good Easter. Thanks.